I think as of recently, sports games have become part of what is a pretty frustrating cycle. It seems with every year comes the latest iteration of the soccer, basketball, and football simulation game, where the only real evolution here is in the year and athletes replaced on the front cover. In fact, it feels like the current popular simulation sports games aren't particularly interested in creating new ways to immerse you in the sport you love, but rather they're focused solely on replicating the experience of watching the sport on TV. And as a result, I consider all of these heavy hitters to be simultaneously plummeting in quality. Part of this has to do with the fact that the market has become somewhat of a duopoly, as 2K Games and EA Sports dominate it, with little room for anyone else to provide legitimate competitive alternatives due to the mountains of money at these developers' disposal. And what's frustrating to me is that the staggering amount they bring in each year, seemingly regardless of their product's quality, essentially renders any counter-argument to their production irrelevant. But if I may indulge in doing so anyway, I think it's this same domination of the genre that's actively hurting it. These games aren't outright bad, but I do have two major issues with them. The first being that I think they're so simulation focused that they don't really offer anything to anyone who isn't already submerged in the sports they're imitating. And the second being that, over time, I think they've slowly sacrificed what I consider to be the fundamental aspects of sports from a spectating perspective to chase that perfect replication of a TV broadcast. So I find it a bit of a shame that these are your leading options should you be in the mood to buy a new sports game for a fun multiplayer game night with friends, because it doesn't have to be like this. In fact, way back when, it didn't used to be like this. See, the genre has a scrappy younger brother who used to be on top of the world until his star fell, but I still remember him. There was this type of sports game that was chaotic, one that would choose a real-world sport and evolve it into a must-see spectacle. These games would flick through a sports rulebook before tossing it into a volcano to create a version of the game that barely resembled its real-life counterpart, but was often way better for it. Rarely did these games contain fouls, stoppages, or even realism. They would instead trim the fat, cutting out the downtime to provide only breakneck speed, exuberant charisma, and a pure, distilled fun that anyone could get in on. Of course, I'm talking about arcade sports games. I maintain that these are some of the most fun you can have playing a game, regardless of whether you have the slightest interest in any of these sports. There's a style and energy to these games that's immediately palpable upon booting them up, as the feelings they both create and emulate as you assume the role of an extreme sports athlete is unlike anything else the medium provides. So in this video, I'd like to highlight some of my favorite arcade sports games and what it is about them that I consider genius. Making a case, albeit an entirely selfish one, as to why I think it's a travesty that this genre has been pushed into the shadows, and why I'm desperate to see it return to the mainstream. But to understand where I'm coming from, why I consider the arcade sports game to be such a riot, especially if you're someone watching this with zero interest in real-life sports, I think we first have to talk about the appeal of watching sports, as it's central to understanding why I think these games are so engaging. So if you're someone who looks at sports fandom and either doesn't get it or thinks it's a little silly, we can still be friends. I'm not looking to convert anyone, but I think it might be helpful here if we answer your question of why it is exactly that meatheads from all around gather and crowd within a pub to watch Michael Jordan punt a knockout touchdown for a hole-in-one or whatever. I think a large part of the appeal of watching sports has to do with humanity's inherent fascination with talented people doing talented things. Admiration is a dangerously powerful emotion, and watching the human body perform at its absolute peak can create some of the most basic yet compelling forms of entertainment. Mostly because what we witness on the field is real. These athletes' respective crafts are, for the most part, an expression of who they are. We get to watch authentic stories of human triumph unfold right before us. In fact, a single team of players can be a collection of stories, and it's a roll of the dice as the game begins as to what the narrative will be and how it will unfold. Perhaps it's one of an underdog rising to the occasion, or of an aging veteran struggling to come to terms with the fact the game they once dominated is beginning to pass them by. And regardless of who holds up the trophy at the end of the season, it's the rise and fall of these incredibly fascinating and determined people that dictate the narrative. Which is why when an athlete is particularly talented, you might have noticed how at times the media could portray them almost like superheroes. At the peak of their industry, their popularity can rival that of music artists or movie stars, and with it comes a similar dedicated and passionate following. And I think it's because much like those industries, the everyday person is able to directly compare their own skill level to the superior talent in question in real time. For example, even though I'm fortunate enough to possess the ability to kick a soccer ball, I am constantly floored at the ability some players have to curl it into the corner of the net, as someone who can barely kick it in a straight line. So as a result, a legitimate connection is established here between an athlete and fan like myself, as I'll become completely enraptured by someone's raw physical talent and decide to follow them on their journey to success. As for the spectator, once that emotional investment is established, following a team or athlete becomes a game in itself. Watching their success or failure, feeling that thrill of victory or agony of defeat with them. A supporter will sign up for this whole thing, understanding that their favorite team or player might not ever win the big one, but you go on that ride anyway because it's fun to feel things. In fact, I'd consider what unfolds in front of you each game is akin to a stage show. Yeah, that's right, sports boys, you have more in common with the theatre kids than you thought. As the act of watching a single game has the potential to be drama, evoking all of the same emotions that come with that. Close games or comebacks are tense, nerve-wracking, joyous, or heartbreaking. And experiencing that with others as a supporter base, a passionate collective, only brings people closer together. And it's when we consider these aspects of watching sport, what I consider the pillars that uphold this weird blurred line between reality and entertainment, that we begin to get a better understanding of the backbone behind sports games. Now, of course, some of this stuff I mentioned can't be directly translated to a video game. I mean, how does one take raw, unscripted reality and replicate it within a Super Nintendo cartridge? So what I mean here is that these sports games I mentioned embody the spirit of these aspects of sports fandom, as silly as that initially sounds. As I think it's only because they draw from the appeal of watching sports, do they succeed as engaging video games. Should any of these titles be stripped of their real or fictional star athletes, stadium backgrounds, announcers, or theatrics, I think they would fail to capture the essence of spectating sports, and would end up feeling like modern-day versions of, well, Pong. So I think it's time we get into some of them, as I discuss those I found the most charming, and highlight what unique twists they each bring to the genre. And let's say we start with Windjammers. I think it's quite apt I mentioned Pong here, as if that game's considered the beginning of the tennis-based subgenre of sports games, then I'd consider Windjammers to sit at this subgenre's apex. Released in 1994, Windjammers is a competitive tennis-style arcade game where the objective is to throw a frisbee past your opponent to score. The key feature here being the restriction of having to stop where you caught it, and the ability to perform special and curling throws. While it doesn't sound terribly exciting, I assure you that rounds of Windjammers have been responsible for some of the most nerve-wracking, heart-in-mouth, scream-out-loud moments I've ever had playing with friends. This game is nail-biting drama of the best kind. With only 30 seconds in a round and the ability to score more points depending on where it is in the goal that your frisbee passes, Windjammers does not stop to breathe. It requires this split-second decision-making, as strategies can be thought about prior to playing, but rarely do you ever have the time or space here to adjust them mid-game. There's just too much pressure to be in the right place. And considering how quick rounds are over, I always end up wanting to immediately jump back in to counter the strategy that caused me to lose last time. It's incredibly addictive. In that sense, Windjammers almost feels like a fighting game, as rarely are you ever playing the quote-unquote game as much as you are playing the opponent. Trying to get them to dive to the top only to throw a quick one to the bottom, or noticing they're playing deep so you drop the frisbee short. Windjammers not only allows but encourages the sneakiest of mind games. It also has a ton of personality for what is essentially Pong. While it remains a tiny detail, the characters' win and loss animations do a lot to tell us about their personalities, offering this game a tongue-in-cheek identity of this inherently goofy sport that consists solely of larger-than-life competitors that take it super seriously. In fact, this combination of incorporating fighting game elements with an endearing visual style and flair would remind me of another game in the genre, While other games in this list might feature the ability to hurt your opponent as a means to help you score, in this next game that is the objective. Essentially, Lethal League is a violent version of Hot Potato as you and your opponent desperately try to survive in a suffocating death arena. What I love about Lethal League is that this is one of the only arcade sports games where I think it's arguably more fun when you don't have the ball. Timing and spacing relative to your opponent is everything. There's that same feeling of escalating pressure here too, and I'd argue it's even more intense as the ball can become too fast. Deep into a rally, there's not much you can do besides pray, as the ball gets difficult to see and near impossible to control. However, it's in this very chaos that also makes for some of the most hype, white-knuckle moments playing with friends, should the defender take the all-or-nothing gamble and attempt to return the hit. However, it'd be naive to dismiss Lethal League as purely a game of chance, as while you might find yourself winning a few points from sheer luck, it's those willing to implement strategy that'll have the most fun and success. Do you risk slowing things down with a bunt to try and reset, or do you hope you've hit the ball with enough speed and back off, waiting for your opponent to make a mistake? Or are you crazy enough to try and grab the rocketing ball out of the air and reroute its trajectory, throwing it straight at your opponent's face? Lethal League is an endlessly layered gameplay loop and also provides that same mental chess game that fighting games do. But where I think this game really stands out is in its presentation and style. Lethal League has this cel-shaded urban underground stylistic flair that's immediately reminiscent of Jet Set Radio. And I'm happy to report its soundtrack is also quite funky. And much like that game, Lethal League also goes beyond just aesthetics to incorporate a wild delinquent attitude into its story and world, providing a reason as to why the characters participate in this sport, even giving a brief history as to how the fictional league began. Now, it didn't need to do that, as other games I mention here aren't lesser for not doing so, but because it did, it helped me better understand the world Lethal League takes place in. For many of these characters, this isn't just a sport, it's a lifestyle, and you can't help but get invested in it with them, as Lethal League provides such a well-crafted sense of place, perfectly capturing that street punk vibe it sets out for. This game is needlessly edgy, and I love it for that. In fact, I think there's a lot of charm to a game that's willing to embrace a specific time and place, whether it be fiction that's based on the real world like Lethal League, or something closer to an actual snapshot of real-world history. In fact, I think the arcade sports genre actually has some of the best examples of this in games, as they often can't help but be tied to hyper-specific periods of time, through things like team rosters and licensed soundtracks. So let's say we now get into a few examples of these, starting with the arcade classic, NBA Jam. Released in arcades in 1993, NBA Jam would become an instant phenomenon. Perhaps the arcade sports game, as I struggle to think of another that would become as immediately successful with a casual audience. And if you've ever played it, it's easy to see why. The ability to pull off some of the most ridiculous moves ever seen on the court with your favorite players of the mid-90s is pure fun. In fact, I'd describe the experience as a bit of a power fantasy, considering just how inhuman some of these dunks are, and the sheer spectacle of the match as screaming fans cheer your every move. This is an experience where all of your actions on the court feel important. Adding to this is the iconic and ever-quotable commentary from the game's announcer. Boom, shakalaka! NBA Jam is big and brash, just like the actual league was becoming at the time. But while this game is remembered as the definitive arcade basketball game, perfectly capturing the spectacle of the sport, I think I prefer its grassroots interpretation in NBA Street Volume 2. While it sacrifices roaring crowds and flashing lights for a more informal urban pickup game, Street Vol 2 is everything I admire about the sport. By comparison to Jam, it barely feels like it's about replicating a professional sports broadcast, but instead a loving homage to the sport and its fanbase, without sacrificing any of the flair, leaning into both the history of the league and the culture of the game. If NBA Jam made my actions feel important, then Street Vol 2 made me feel like I was part of some underground basketball fight club where the best in the world gather to entertain only themselves. Not only is its laid-back, friends just goofing around approach to the sport ever endearing, with an exceedingly charismatic announcer in DJ Cucumber Slice.
Oh man, that's beautiful! That's beautiful like a hot summer day when you see the market on the corner.
Its gameplay also feels like an evolution of the formula created by Jam. Rather than having the reward for your silly dunk exist solely as an animation for you to enjoy, the stylish showboating moves of Street Vol 2 are also quantified with a point value, and when multiple moves are performed in quick succession, a combo can be started and banked if you manage to hit the shot. Meaning all of a sudden this stylish gameplay isn't just for show, but now the viable strategy for beating your opponent. Street Volume 2 teaches and actively encourages you to play with a flair and bullishness, meaning when up against friends, it almost doesn't matter who actually wins the game because both competitors know the real winner is the person who pulled off the funkiest combo. In fact, I think the ability for an arcade sports game to reward the better player while still allowing enough wiggle room for a casual player to potentially win is a difficult balance to achieve, but one that creates incredibly addictive gameplay when done right. My favorite example of this kind of game is Super Mario Strikers on the GameCube. This game manages to strike, pun certainly intended, a perfect balance between soccer simulation and arcade tomfoolery. See, to win a match in Strikers, there's no better strategy than playing good soccer. From crossing the ball into the box, to chipping it over an out-of-position goalkeeper, it's an understanding of the real-world fundamentals that allows for success. However, with the addition of Mario Kart-like items to use against your opponent, as well as randomized interceptions from the Mushroom Kingdom Goon Squad, means there's also that similar degree of arcade chaos, adding another layer to the narrative of the match, but with the exception that it rarely affects the outcome. I mean, there's no item in the game that will just gift you a goal. All they do is open or close space, allowing for some really cheeky offense and defense. So while they do create more opportunities to score for the player that uses them wisely, it's not a crutch that the player can rely on. But what does get a casual player involved at a gathering with friends, and allows for potentially anyone to win a match, is the fact that what's presented here is still the universally recognized and understood game of football. It's just been spruced up with some juicy bonuses. In fact, out of all of the games on my list here, Strikers might be my favorite to score in. Nothing comes close to giving me that sense of satisfaction and achievement when I manage to bang one into the back of the net. The way the game enters a Matrix-like slow-mo gives that all-important kick the weight and impact it deserves. Touching on the perfected game balance that I mentioned earlier, another aspect of Strikers that I thought was genius in appealing to a wider audience was the super goal mechanic. Not only does it allow for that same degree of comebacks and upsets like in Street Vol 2, but a super goal also isn't particularly time-consuming or difficult to pull off. As even if your timing is just a little bit slow, and you're at such an angle that the goalkeeper is off their line, you might still score it anyway. Meaning this massive game-altering move is something that just about anyone who picked up a controller can perform if they're quick enough. And it's this calculated chaos combined with that sound soccer foundation that results in an experience that's just a pure joy to play with friends. But while we've mostly covered games that let you live out the fantasy of being a professional athlete, emulating the feeling of playing a real-world sport, I'd like to now talk about another important part of the genre. The arcade sports games that let you perform the unimaginable. As another big part of the appeal of these games for me is the fantasy that they let me live out. While there's some arcade sports games that do a great job in evolving a sport that I have real-world experience with, I also tend to gravitate towards those that let me participate in sports that aren't available to me. The SSX series is a perfect example of this. These snowboarding games are one of the finest examples I can give of what I guess you'd call artificial adrenaline. Possessing this innate ability to be breathtaking as you rocket down and glide off of enormous snow slopes from unimaginable heights. It also offers me specifically an escape, as someone who can't realistically participate in such a sport regularly. And while I have a fondness for SSX Tricky due to its outrageous characters and soundtrack, it's the third game that I'd like to talk about here. This game lets you pull off some of the most mind-bending, gravity-defying snowboarding tricks imaginable, as it lets me feel like a snow-covered demigod when in reality I'm just pressing a few buttons. In fact, I think that's one of the game's greatest strengths, where even if you haven't played the game before, you can pick it up and immediately begin pulling off crazy stunts seemingly by random button press. Of course, the more skilled player will know precisely what buttons to press in order to get the highest scores, but the level of enjoyment here doesn't depend on that. Should we imagine a line graph that displays skill level steadily increasing over time spent playing, I honestly think that one's enjoyment level doesn't necessarily follow that path as well like you'd expect it to. From an SSX mega fan to someone picking it up for the first time, I think the exact same engaging snowboarding experience is not only shared, but immediately achievable. Largely because the controls and track design of SSX3 are so superbly crafted that anyone has the potential to build enormous high scores while racing, getting the best out of both traditional game modes at the same time. These varied levels are twisting, winding, and dangerous, offering an absurd verticality that most other racing games just can't provide. And like NBA Street Volume 2 and Tricky before it, SSX3 is also focused on capturing the time it was made in, leaning into the edgy pop culture of the era. The game is blessed with the most 2003 licensed soundtrack featuring some of the funkiest electronica, dance, and alternative rap music to ever grace your ears. Perhaps most impressive though is SSX3's ability to translate the extreme sport of snowboarding into a video game that's something more. See, a lot of arcade sports games are granted the privilege of replicating a sport that's rule set is already rock solid. The developer's focus then becomes to build upon those sports rules with their own video game rules to create something more fun and arcadey. But with real-life snowboarding, the events are a little more one-dimensional. I'm sure you can imagine something like this being translated directly into a video game, and it could still be fun. But I think it might also lack the depth required to become a substantial experience. What the SSX series did that I find so impressive is that the developers essentially invented their own type of extreme sport based on reality without replicating it. It isn't interested in emulating the feeling of watching Olympic snowboarding on television, but rather in immersing you exclusively within the heights of that sport, cranking the experience up to 11 and building upon that with their own personality. SSX3 is something that can only exist as a video game, carelessly abandoning realism to provide non-stop action and entertainment. It's actually a philosophy that was taken from those early Tony Hawk's Pro Skater games, as they too would choose to present their gameplay from the perspective of a cool hobby as opposed to a traditional sport. A decision that not only allows for an endless amount of possibilities when it comes to implementing unique arcade shenanigans, but one that also allowed the game to develop its own identity. Any semblance of simulation in either of these games were traded in to appeal to the rap-listening, bird-flipping, mall-loitering, Thrasher t-shirt wearing punk kid from the suburbs specifically named Kyle, and I think they're better for it. So, while my list here could go on for another dozen games, I mean I've yet to even discuss the Skate series, motorsports, and the arcade racing games, I think I've made my argument here in attempting to prove that this subgenre isn't just a cash grab based off of sporting licenses designed to appeal to the masses. Many arcade sports games have genuine substance. Not only do they evolve our favorite sports in new and exciting ways we've never seen before, they also allow those that aren't interested in sports to experience those same feelings that passionate sports fans do, providing a wonderfully original spin on the same entertainment, theatre, and competition of real-world sports, presented in a way that lets you get in on the action. Most importantly though, they also just bring people together, creating legitimate human connection through their gameplay. An experience based on simplicity and accessibility that manages to remain wildly entertaining without sacrificing any of the strategy or fun. And I think that's a feat that in itself should be marveled and celebrated. Which is why I think it's a shame the genre is currently taking a back seat. It hasn't gone away, it's just not in the limelight like it used to be. Maybe it wouldn't hurt as much if what surpassed it within the market wasn't so lifeless, yet incredibly successful. Regardless, and perhaps I'm naive for thinking so, I'm going to keep optimistic about the future of arcade sports games. Like fighting games in the 2000s, I'd like to think we're just in a lull period before the genre explodes again. I mean, as esports continues to grow beyond these staggering new heights, the potential for arcade sports games appears to be limitless. So whether it's watching them in a tournament on a grand stage with thousands of spectators in attendance and countless more tuning in online, not unlike an actual sports event, or even if it's just playing them on the couch with some pals, I'll be here for them. Thanks for watching.